When I bought my dream home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I thought I had finally found peace. The lawns were manicured, the streets were lined with trees, and everyone smiled when you passed by. It looked perfect, too perfect, perhaps. I didn't know then that behind those friendly faces and neat hedges lurked an invisible army, the HOA. The Homeowners Association ruled this place with an iron fist disguised in polite newsletters. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, how bad could a group of neighbors with clipboards be? My first few months went smoothly. I kept my yard clean, paid my dues on time, and followed the rules to the letter. But peace rarely lasts long when power-hungry people smell weakness. My problems began when I decided to paint my mailbox. It was a small thing, just a fresh coat of black paint, the same shade it already was. Within a week, I received my first notice. According to the HOA, I had used an unapproved shade of black. I stared at the letter, stunned. There were apparently 12 approved shades of black in the community guidelines, and mine was not one of them. At first, I laughed. It had to be a mistake. I politely replied, attached a receipt showing that the paint matched the original color, and thought that would be the end of it. But 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, this time with a $50 fine attached. That's when I realized what I was dealing with. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were enforcing control. Every week after that, a new letter appeared in my mailbox. My grass was half an inch too tall. My trash cans were visible from the street. My driveway had a minor oil stain. It was endless. They picked apart every tiny detail of my property until I started to dread coming home. Then came the meeting. I decided to attend one of their monthly HOA board meetings to clear the air. The president, a woman named Marcia, ran the room like a courtroom judge. Her smile was cold, her voice sharp, and her eyes full of quiet judgment. She sat at the head of the table surrounded by her loyal committee, neighbors who nodded at every word she said. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly explained the situation, the endless notices, and the harassment I'd been dealing with. Marcia leaned back, smirked slightly, and said something that stuck with me. Rules are rules. If you can't follow them, maybe this neighborhood isn't right for you. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. That smug, condescending certainty that she had the power and I didn't. I left that meeting burning with anger. They thought they could bully me into silence, but they had underestimated the wrong person. The next few weeks were pure misery. The HOA doubled down. I started getting fines almost weekly. They accused me of leaving my recycling bins out too long, parking slightly over the line in my own driveway, even having non-standard outdoor lighting. It became clear that they were targeting me deliberately. Every time I tried to fight back, they found another excuse to hit me with a new notice. But then, something strange happened. My next-door neighbor, a quiet man named Steve, slipped me a copy of the HOA's internal meeting notes. He had been a member once but left after clashing with Marcia. He told me they had actually discussed me, by name, in one of their meetings. Apparently, Marcia had taken a personal dislike to me from the start. She didn't like people who questioned authority. I was their new project, the example they wanted to make. That's when my mindset shifted. I was done defending myself. It was time to play offense. I started by learning everything I could about the HOA. Their rules, their financials, their history, it was all public record. What I found shocked me. The HOA had been collecting thousands of dollars in special fees over the years, supposedly for maintenance projects that were never completed. There were also several questionable expenses listed in there. Financial reports, payments to consultants and vendors that didn't seem to exist. It was clear that something shady was going on. But I couldn't act yet. I needed proof, solid proof. So, I started attending every HOA meeting, taking notes, recording statements, and talking quietly with other homeowners who had also been mistreated. Slowly, a small group of us formed a quiet alliance, neighbors tired of being pushed around. One of them, an elderly woman named Karen, ironically, not that kind of Karen, had lived here for 20 years. She told me about how Marcia had bullied a single mother into selling her home over unapproved fence height. Another neighbor revealed that the HOA president's brother owned the landscaping company that got most of the neighborhood contracts. The puzzle pieces were coming together. It was no longer about the mailbox or the grass. This was corruption, plain and simple. And I wasn't just going to expose it, I was going to dismantle it from the inside out. The plan started forming in my mind. First, I'd gather undeniable evidence of the misuse of funds. Then I'd rally enough homeowners to demand an audit. And finally, I'd use their own bylaws against them to call for a leadership vote. If everything worked, Marcia and her clique would be out for good. But I had to be careful. If they suspected what I was doing, they'd find a way to shut me down before I got close. So I played along, pretending to comply, acting polite at meetings, even agreeing to pay some of the smaller fines just to keep them off my back. All the while, I was documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every absurd accusation, it all went into a growing folder of evidence that would soon become their downfall. Then, one morning, I found something that changed everything. While checking the HOA's public website, I stumbled upon an outdated link that led to archived documents. Inside were old financial statements that had never been deleted. And there, buried in a spreadsheet, was a list of payments made to a company under Marcia's husband's name. Thousands of dollars paid for community upgrades that never existed. That was the smoking gun. As I sat there staring at the screen, I realized the balance of power had finally shifted. The HOA had spent months trying to break me, but they had only made me stronger, and now, I had the weapon that could destroy them. The next chapter of this story wouldn't be about defense anymore. It would be about revenge. Once the payroll line with Marcia's husband's company appeared on my screen, everything shifted from irritation to calculation. For weeks I had been collecting paper, every notice, every fine, every hyper-specific complaint about my lawn. But this spreadsheet was different, it was a clear trail of money. Corruption, once suspected, now had a ledger. The truth had weight, and weight changes how people move. I started by tightening the evidence chain. Records and receipts are only useful if they're organized and unassailable. I printed copies, time-stamped digital files, and backed them up in 3 places. I cataloged the HOA notices in chronological order, cross-referencing each fine with meeting minutes and vendor invoices. When the HOA claimed a contractor had been hired for pavement upgrades, I found the invoice attached to a different neighborhood. When they said funds were spent on a community festival, there was no permit, no receipts for rentals, and no photos. Each mismatch was a weak link I intended to snap. Knowledge felt dangerous in Marcia's world, secrecy was her shield. So I moved quietly. I stopped attending meetings impulsively and instead began to blend in. I sat near the back, taking notes with a pen that left permanent marks. I recorded public portions of meetings on my phone, legal in our state when it's a public gathering, and I didn't hide that I was doing so. The recordings were dry, procedural, filled with polite language that thinly veiled influence and favoritism, contract awards approved without bids, maintenance projects delayed despite assessments, weird line items paid to unfamiliar names. Hearing the audio later, the pattern was obvious, a small circle steering community money into familiar hands. Next I widened my circle. Corruption survives on isolation, it dies under sunlight. I knocked on doors, carefully, respectfully, and only when homeowners wanted to talk. Some were hesitant, they'd been frightened into silence by threats of fines or petty retaliation. Others were ready to speak, relieved to find someone with the same evidence-based approach. An elderly couple who'd been fined for allegedly painting their front door an unapproved shade, produced envelopes of letters from the HOA going back years. A young family showed me canceled checks for landscaping consultations that were identical in amount and timing to payments shown under Marcia's husband's company. Small injustices began to add up to a pattern large enough to stand on its own 2 feet. I drafted an action plan, audit, petition, vote. The HOA's bylaws provided a narrow but crucial opening. Homeowners had the right to demand an independent financial audit if a certain percentage signed a petition. It was a tedious threshold to hit, but that was the point. The clause existed because HOA boards feared accountability. I prepared an accessible, plain-language summary of the evidence for other homeowners, what I had found, why it mattered, and what the audit could uncover. I kept the tone clinical. Anger sells headlines but sobriety wins votes. We started collecting signatures. We made a simple 3-page packet, a cover letter explaining the petition, a 1-page bulleted evidence summary, and a petition form with space for signatures, parcel numbers, and dates. We left packets on porches, slid them under garage doors, and handed them to people at the local coffee shop where neighbors gathered. We respected privacy and never pressured anyone to sign. The goal was to build a community case based on consent, not coercion. As signatures grew, Marcia noticed. Her polite detachment at meetings shifted to thinly veiled hostility. She sent more notices to those who attended our private gatherings, warnings about unauthorized meetings. There were subtle attempts to intimidate, an anonymous flyer suggesting the petitioners were troublemakers, a notice claiming that participation in outside campaigns violated HOA rules. None of it held up legally, but the intention was clear, sow fear so the signatures would stop. We countered with transparency. I set up an information table at the community yard sale and handed out plain copies of the budget discrepancies, the vendor lists, and the petition requirements. I created a private online portal for people to verify that their signatures were counted, simple, non-technical checks so everyone could feel assured. When people saw the evidence and the process, the fear melted. Neighbors who had kept their heads down for years began to sign. Word spread fast. Trust is contagious when someone pulls the curtain back. With enough signatures collected to force the audit, the next phase required formality. We filed the petition per the bylaws, making sure every I was dotted and every requirement met. The board had 30 days to respond. During that window, my inbox filled with nervous messages and late-night questions. I answered each one patiently, attaching scanned copies of supporting documents and explaining the audit process in plain steps. For many, this was their first time looking under the hood of community governance. The process itself became cathartic. Homeowners felt reclaimed. Meanwhile, I prepared for the board's likely maneuvering. If there was one thing I'd learned in that first month, it was that power rarely concedes without a fight. Marcia called an emergency meeting under the pretext of community engagement. She presented what she called a transparency packet, a glossy binder that attempted to explain away the payments and obfuscate timelines. I listened as she spoke, already recorded, already catalogued, but I kept my composure. Arguments rooted in charm are tempting to rebut emotionally, but they don't withstand documented facts. Public pressure did what legal language sometimes cannot. Neighbors started showing up to meetings in greater numbers. People who had previously been too intimidated to speak sat forward, asking straightforward questions about payments and vendor selection criteria. We requested copies of contracts and bid processes. When Marcia balked, citing privacy or proprietary reasons, the room filled with skepticism. The optics were bad, a small group of board members refusing to open records to homeowners whose dues funded the very services in question. I also reached out to local media, carefully. This was not a crusade for clicks, it was a strategy to ensure that the story was reported responsibly. A neighborhood is more than headline fodder, and I made sure the request stressed the evidence, the petition, and the homeowner's right to know. A local reporter visited, interviewed several residents, all on the record, and looked through the documents. When the piece ran, it was measured and factual, focusing on the discrepancies and the pending audit rather than sensationalized revenge. The article did something crucial, it let residents know they were not alone, and it let the board know the rest of the town was watching. The audit was scheduled. An independent accounting firm was hired by vote, the vote we had demanded, to review the HOA's books. For weeks I watched like a hawk as auditors combed through ledgers and contracts. The firm's preliminary questions mirrored what I had already found: payments routed oddly, contracts without competitive bidding, and invoices that didn't match completed work. The auditors asked for clarifications that the board struggled to produce. It was painfully bureaucratic but devastating in its slowness. Each unanswered question became another sign of malpractice. And yet, even as the audit unfolded, tensions escalated. The board retaliated in small administrative ways: a sudden uptick in enforcement notices for petition signers, a delay in responding to maintenance requests, and a public relations campaign painting the petitioners as disruptors. These moves were petty and transparent, designed to make life difficult for those who had the courage to speak. But they also exposed the board's priorities, defending their position over serving the community. One evening, as I reviewed another batch of scanned invoices, I realized how fragile their control was. The HOA's power lay not in law enforcement but in the community's willingness to accept opaque leadership. We had reactivated that willingness into civic engagement. Neighbors were now asking pointed questions at meetings, signing petitions for board elections, and demanding open bidding for contracts. If the audit confirmed what we suspected, the board's removal would be less revenge than restoration, a reclaiming of a community that belonged to everyone, not a handful of insiders. The auditors released a preliminary report with redacted names but clear findings: misallocated funds, contracts awarded without competitive bids, and payments that lacked supporting documentation. The language was dry, numbers and percentages and accounting terms, but the impact was loud. The board scrambled to craft responses, but their counterarguments felt defensive and thin. Victory, however, was not yet guaranteed. The bylaws required a formal vote to remove directors, and the people with the power to cast that vote were the homeowners themselves. So we turned outward: voter education, transparent ballots, and a rally, not a riot, of informed citizens ready to exercise their rights. Legal channels, neighbor solidarity, and public accountability were our tools. This was not about humiliating anyone, it was about restoring trust. As Chapter 2 closed, the neighborhood had shifted. What began as petty enforcement against a mailbox had evolved into a community-wide reckoning. The evidence we'd gathered had become a weapon not of destruction, but of renovation. The audit had dug up rot, the community was ready to rebuild. The climax was coming: a showdown at the next annual meeting, where ballots, bylaws, and the weight of documented truth would. The annual HOA meeting arrived with the tension of a courtroom trial. Weeks of quiet preparation had built to this single night. Folding chairs lined the community hall, every one filled with homeowners who, for once, weren't there to listen, they were there to act. The murmur of voices carried a different tone now: determination instead of resignation. Outside, porch lights glowed across the neighborhood, silent witnesses to a moment that had been brewing for months. Marcia stood at the front, her polished smile stretched thin. She was still trying to project control: clipboards stacked neatly, documents labeled in pristine folders, but the confidence she once carried had turned brittle. Her inner circle sat beside her, whispering nervously. They knew the audit results had changed everything. The report, though carefully written in accounting language, was devastating. It revealed misallocated funds, payments to family-owned companies, and a lack of transparency that even loyal board members could no longer defend. As the meeting began, Marcia followed her usual script. She opened with a summary of community improvements, thanked her committee for their dedication, and reminded everyone of the HOA's important role in maintaining standards. It was the same performance she had given for years, except this time, the audience wasn't applauding. People sat still, waiting. The weight of unspoken questions hung in the air. When the floor opened for homeowner comments, the first person to stand wasn't me, it was Mrs. Green, one of the oldest residents. Her voice trembled, but her words didn't. She held up a copy of the audit report and asked one simple question: where did the money go? The room went silent. Marcia fumbled through papers, claiming that all expenditures had been necessary for community management. But before she could regain control, another homeowner rose, then another. They cited specific figures from the report, payments with no corresponding cross defensively at the start now rested on laps. People leaned forward, listening. When I finished, I placed a single sheet of paper on the podium, the motion for a leadership vote. According to the bylaws, if 30% of homeowners requested it, the current board could be dissolved and re-elected. We had well over 60%. The motion was seconded immediately by a man from the back row, then supported by nearly every hand in the room. Marcia's expression froze, then hardened. She called for a procedural delay, but the bylaws didn't allow it. The vote would happen tonight. Ballots were distributed. Simple slips of paper with two choices: retain or remove. As people marked their votes, you could feel the collective exhale of a neighborhood finally reclaiming its voice. When the votes were counted, 3 volunteers verifying every ballot, the results were undeniable. The board was dissolved by overwhelming majority. Marcia and her allies were officially removed. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, quietly at first, the room erupted in applause. Not the loud, cheering kind, but the long, grateful kind that comes after months of tension finally break. Relief washed over faces that had been tight with anxiety for years. Marcia gathered her papers, her posture rigid. She tried to keep her composure as she announced she would seek legal counsel, but even she seemed to know the fight was over. She left the hall without looking back. The aftermath was both chaotic and liberating. A temporary committee was formed to oversee the transition. The audit's full report would be shared publicly, and new elections were scheduled for the following month. For the first time, meetings would be recorded and published online. Budgets would be transparent. Contracts would require open bidding. Every decision would have oversight. As days turned into weeks, the change in the neighborhood was palpable. The constant stream of warning letters stopped. Yards no longer felt like potential violations. Waiting to happen, they looked like homes again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years began chatting on sidewalks. Children played freely without worried parents glancing toward the HOA office window. The sense of community that had been buried under bureaucracy was finally resurfacing. Then came the final twist, the one that made my revenge truly complete. A few weeks later, during the follow-up phase of the audit, the accounting firm released an addendum. Several payments made to Marcia's husband's company were flagged for potential fraud and referred to state investigators. It turned out that the firm wasn't licensed to provide the services it had billed for. The matter was forwarded to authorities for further review. Justice, as it turned out, had its own pace, but it always arrived. Word spread fast. Marcia's name was whispered in town gossip, but I didn't take pleasure in her downfall. My satisfaction came from something deeper, the restoration of fairness. The system that had once been used to intimidate me had now turned against its abusers. In the following months, I was asked to run for the new HOA board. I hesitated at first. Revenge had never been my end goal, only accountability. But I realized something important: if good people avoided leadership out of frustration, power would always fall into the wrong hands. So, I accepted. Not to rule, but to rebuild. Under the new leadership, the HOA transformed from a weapon of control into a tool of collaboration. Rules were still enforced, but with logic and fairness. Fines became rare, communication open, and meetings productive. The neighborhood thrived, not because the rules changed, but because the spirit behind them did. Sometimes, when I walked past my now perfectly ordinary black mailbox, I couldn't help but smile. That small object had started a chain reaction that toppled corruption and restored integrity. My revenge hadn't been about humiliation or chaos, it had been about exposing truth and returning. Looking back, I realized that Marcia had been right about one thing: this neighborhood wasn't right for someone who couldn't follow the rules. But what she didn't understand was that rules mean nothing without fairness. The HOA had messed with the wrong homeowner, yes. But the real legend wasn't my revenge, it was how one voice sparked a community to stand up, speak out, and take back its home.